up, guys? Welcome back to Before the Whistle. I'm your host, Maddy, and as I'm continuing this coaching series this off season and just kind of exploring coaches that stick out to me, Dan Campbell was really the first one on my list. And the more that I've kind of thought about it after kind of building upon that in my Sean Payton episode last week, just really kind of thinking about what traits make a good head coach. And it just continues to stick out to me that the human elements, the personality, the ability to relate and connect and form relationships with players and be kind of an emotional sounding board for them. As much as we talk about this game being a violent sport with mentally tough guys, with very complex playbook schemes, personnel groupings, what have you, what do you do in a situation where, again, your team isn't winning any games and you're a first-year head coach? How do you kind of handle that? What do you say to these guys? What do you do with a quarterback who kind of got cast off like the ugly duckling in a way and goes from somewhere like LA to Detroit? And how do you kind of get him to believe in himself? And I think it's valuable at that point to talk to people that really have a sense of how things have changed for the Lions, what Dan Campbell really brings in his presence, in his command. And that can only really come from people that have covered that team. When I did my injury episode, I had kind of said where I think perception of injury and your team being an injury-riddled team, it's hard for me to say that the Saints, for example, are more injury prone than other teams because I just don't pay attention to them that often. But honestly, the last two seasons, the Detroit Lions have caught my attention. And so I wanted to bring on someone, and that's Jeremy Reisman. He is the head of Pride of Detroit and was actually, when I first got into this industry and I was writing for Canal Street Chronicles over on SB Nation, which is where Pride of Detroit is also housed, that my first podcast guest episode was actually appearing on Jeremy Reisman's podcast with the Detroit Lions podcast that they had, because the Saints and the Lions played each other that season. And I remember just immediately feeling comfortable with these guys. And at that point, I'm on my iPhone in the office that I had set up for myself, which was just in the middle of the living room in the pandemic. I had no idea what to do or say on a podcast, but there was just kind of the shared gritty identity of, granted, the Saints have seen more success, but we talked about it in the episode, but there are teams that, long-term speaking, are kind of been perennially dysfunctional. And so there was kind of that kinship of that cynicism and sarcasm. And I really remember just connecting with them and then seeing him at the Senior Bowl. Again, I always say that it's about human beings and relationships in this industry, but quite literally, yet again, I've managed to find another non-conventional journalist, and learning that he also had a similar background in psychology, it really, I think, brought value to this conversation, and looking at Dan Campbell as a human being rather than a set of play calls or, like we said, being some scheme type genius. And it might be a subconscious thing, but I think when you have a background in learning about human behavior, what makes people tick, how relationships with different groups of people matter, that all really gets bolstered by that background. And it led to a really rich conversation about coaching and what it really takes to become a winner, especially when you've really been a perennial loser. And without further ado, my expert on the Detroit Lions.
It kind of came about in a strange way. I did not go to school for journalism, psychology. And so I just started writing for Pride of Detroit on the side. They have like fan post sections on all the SB Nation sites. And so I just started writing there. And eventually the guy who ran the site was like, "Hey, do you want to like write on the site?" And I'm like, "Yeah, let's do that. That sounds fun." And so started doing that. I started kind of being the number 2 guy there. And then he stepped down in 2015. And I was the first name that he recommended. And I took the job. It wasn't really a full-time job at that point. So I was still balancing other work while I was actually living in LA at the time. And then we got credentialed in 2017, 2 years later. And at that point, I'm like, oh, I should be living in Michigan now. And so I moved back in 2018. We got full credentials, and then I became full-time, like actual full-time last year. So it's literally been my only sports job. And it's kind of crazy how I got here.
It's really weird how you literally mentioned just kind of all that. I don't know if you know, I also went to school for psychology.
No, yeah,
Yeah.
I did not know that.
And it seems to be this theme of this show where half the people, more than half at this point, like didn't have a conventional background in this industry.
Right.
But also what you said about being in the place that you cover it. Like I started in Philadelphia. That's when I was on your guys' show.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you quickly realize there's just only so much that you can observe from
Yeah.
afar. And so are you from Michigan originally?
Yep. I grew up here, big fan of the team when I grew up, which is why, I started writing about them for fun. I was like, I literally got started in 2018 when they went 0-16, and it was like, it's a form of self-therapy. Like, that's what it was.
I get that. That's again, I also started writing for fun. I was just bored at my current jobs, but figured, yeah, like I followed this team since I was 11, 12 years old. I might as well try to do something to not be so bored all the time.
Yeah,
but
you're passionate about it.
The 0-16 season, that's one to start with. And my dad is from Cleveland. He's a Browns fan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Saints like won the Super Bowl, but initially growing up, those were kind of my picks of the litter, were these kind of just perpetually dysfunctional organizations. And so how do you kind of find a balance in keeping, I guess this is more in a few years ago, because I kind of want to get to how things have changed now, but starting then, how did you kind of keep fans engaged? And did you, try to be optimistic, or how do you kind of handle covering a winless season?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, that was literally my first year, so I didn't really know what I was doing. I probably didn't really have much of an audience at the time, and so it was mostly self-serving. And there are some influence I have, because that felt like right around the boom of personal blogs, like just personal blogs, sports blogs talking about the team, and I naturally geared myself towards those writers rather than maybe traditional news writers, because of the emotion in those. Like, because like it was like kind of like a form of self-therapy. Like, it helps to hear other people going through the same stuff. It's an amazing experience to go through so many struggles as a sports fan, and to see and hear other people kind of be able to explain that experience in such an eloquent way. And so that was kind of where I was going for early in my career, and that's not really where I am anymore. But it's just like to have that place where I can vent, and hopefully someone else can relate and feel the frustration of a hopeless team.
Yeah, and you kind of figure it out along the way. I kind of can again relate, where I think I was a little more emotional in the first year that I started writing, just because you start as a fan, and then I don't know what the switch is. I know people tell you to like separate yourself, but it just kind of got to a point for me where like being there every day, not to say it took the magic out of things, but it did make it kind of feel more like a professional thing. And I almost felt like it switched from being the emotional spokesperson for people to being kind of like the voice of reason that tempers a fan base that I think, again, there's some similarities here in the fan bases where they've dealt with a lot of dysfunction and don't have much patience.
Right. Yeah, no, I think, I'm right, lock and step in there with you as well, because once you get in the building, you kind of understand, like, you have an opportunity that not a lot of people have, and you have an obligation to be as level-headed as possible. And obviously you don't want to sound like a fan when you're talking to the players. They're probably not going to respond well to that either. But yeah, like, I do kind of feel like now that I have that legitimacy to my voice, there is a reputation that I have to uphold, and be like, okay, listen, like, I want all of this awesome joy and success that you guys do, but like, here's the matter of fact, like, here's what these people are saying. And so I have now kind of, I used to think of myself as a pretty optimistic fan, and I think you kind of have to be to even be a fan of an 0-16 team. But now like, they literally call me the wet blanket sometimes, because I feel, and I think part of that is just like the Lions are a team on the rise, and it's my natural tendency, I think, to be like, okay, when's the other shoe going to drop? But at the same time, it is like, okay, I can see like the fan accounts, right? The people that are just fan accounts, I can see where they're kind of flying off the handle, and I can see what we call them, the SOLers, the same old Lionsers. I can see them, and so like, I try to navigate a middle way point. But like, yeah, I think you can fall in either direction, and I've been called in both directions. It's usually a sign that I'm probably doing things right, but I think I do kind of tend to maybe skew a little bit towards let's pull back the reins a little bit. Let's look at this objectively as much as possible, because I'll be the first to admit too, like I'm not completely objective. I don't think anyone can ever be, achieve full objectivity, but yeah, I don't know. I like to be the furthest away I can distance myself from total buy-in, I guess. Means I protect my feelings a little bit more. I manage my expectations so I don't get crushed at the end of the year.
Yeah, to be honest, like it's been a lot more relaxing the last few seasons. I just remember, I mean, Saints fans wise, the Minnesota Miracle, the no call, and then the way that Drew Brees went out, I just didn't have anything left to give at that point.
Yeah,
emotionally, but for me, I don't know if it's something that you explicitly draw on, but now I'm kind of curious. I feel like a psychology degree is just a really good general pathway for a lot of people. And I had dreams of doing something more specific in that field, but I think just understanding how much psychology goes into things like decision-making and human behavior. And it's not always like mental health crises kind of thing that I think people think when you talk about psychology, but is that something that's ever on your mind or helps you kind of tool what you're doing in your journalism?
it's an interesting thought. I mean, at first I would say probably not, because like you, I think I had a more direct focus on what I wanted to do with that degree originally. But in the last, really since Dan Campbell took over the Lions, I've started to think more about the psychology of the game, because I've never really bought into the culture thing. I thought that was always kind of just a buzzword that coaches throw around. And, in Detroit, we've seen the culture change in different directions. Like we've seen Jim Caldwell, a super respectable guy, a good leader. But once the losing started, it was a bad culture. They weren't like, he was too much of a player's coach. And then you get over to Matt Patricia, and he's an authoritarian. He's finally going to whip this team into shape. They're finally going to treat this like the job that it is. And that falls apart. So that culture doesn't work. But now, it almost feels like Dan Campbell has been a happy medium of that. And so I think the psychology part of it, like you said, it's not necessarily a mental health thing. It's being relatable. It's being a good teacher. It's understanding how to relate to different people who take in information differently. And that's one thing that I have really bought in with the Lions, is like, I do think they have a set of coaches, a set of general managers, even ownership that understands how to manage people, which is a huge part of the game that I think I took for granted earlier.
Yeah, I really like how you put that too, because I'm so used to the idea of culture, having Sean Payton really instill that so long ago, and hard to ignore again that that's Dan Campbell's mentor. And a lot more parallels between those two really than I would have expected at first. But yeah, as I've kind of been exploring this podcast, I've been doing this like month of coaching series, and Dan Campbell is where I wanted to start. I've just been like from afar fascinated by everything that he's done there. Just remember reading an article where it said something about how Dan Campbell is building a culture in Detroit, like you said. And at that point they were 0-8.
Right.
And for someone to build a culture when you have not won a single game as a new head coach, I've also kind of bought in from afar, but I kind of remember he came almost out of nowhere in the head coaching search. He wasn't someone that, had been touted as this upcoming offensive guru. And maybe that's the point here. My last interview with my boss, actually, Dave Grubb, we were talking about how there is this kind of like new wave of the Sean McVays and whoever the guy was in Dallas that was that whiz kid on offense. But to me, that's why you have coordinators and coaches and all of that. But you need the head coach to have like a command and be able to, like you said, understand the pulse and the heart of the team. But what was really the initial reaction in Detroit? I know there was all this talk about, the kneecap thing, but for some people that kind of stuff works. I'm just curious kind of how that train has gone for the last 2 years.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny that the kneecap stuff, because I think that played nationally a lot differently than it did play locally. And honestly, I don't think that was the most poignant moment from that opening presser locally. Like there were a lot of things he said that really resonated with fans, is like, listen, there's nothing I can say right here, right now, that's going to convince you that I'm going to turn this team into a winner. I don't want to be the guy that talks a lot. I want to be, you know, the guy that puts into action. And yeah, there was plenty of skepticism to start because like you said, he wasn't one of these hot new coaching candidates. And the Vogue thing was to go with the smart offensive line or some offensive minded guy. My initial reaction was healthy skepticism, I would say, because the biggest thing I was wondering is exactly what you said is how is he going to support? How's he going to get that offensive coordinator? How's he going to get how good is he at how connected is he? You know, he played or he coached in Miami, he coached in New Orleans. That's kind of it. So does he have maybe a limited network and won't be able to hire good people around him? I'll be completely honest. I wanted Brandon Staley. That was my dude at the time. Another young, bright mind, defensive side of the ball. But and I think there's a healthy debate there too, right? Because I'm not going to sit here and say like Dan Campbell's doing it the right way. You have to get a leadership guy. That has to be his primary trait. He has to be a leader. The football stuff can come secondary because the Lions find themselves in an interesting situation now because they have Ben Johnson, who is that offensive coordinator on the rise, the young guy that everyone wants as the next head coach. You could lose him. That is a big piece to have because you're not going to be like, all right, well, I guess you're co-head coach with like they're not going to do that with him. Dan Campbell's a humble guy. I don't think he would ever do a co-head coach situation. So, you know, having that offensive mind has clearly shot the Lions kind of into contender category and losing it when they inevitably lose him. Who knows what's going to happen? But the one thing that Dan Campbell has really shown throughout the 2 years now is that he's willing and able to find those people to replace. They've made kind of a surprising amount of coaching changes just in these 2 years, and he's done a good job with it. He's some people have left for personal reasons. They've had a couple firings, and I really feel like they're doing a good job filling in those necessary holes. It shows that maybe he is a little bit more connected than I expected. I think it shows that he has created again, to bring up the word culture, I think he's created a good culture where people are seeing the Lions job as a good opportunity, which is not something we've been able to say for 60 years.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't say what Dan Campbell doing is the way to find a head coach, but now I think, again, this is kind of new to me to understand is like, I understand the benefits of going leadership type rather than maybe an X's and O's guys. And that's not to take away. I mean, Dan Campbell was a tight end for a decade in this league. You have to know a lot of football to play tight end.
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to take anything away from his X's and O's, but he's also part of it. I think his good leadership is delegation. He keeps his hands off when he needs to, puts his hand on the scales when he wants to, but mostly stays off. And that has, I think, worked quite a bit so far in his 2 years here.
That's what stuck out to me is he has the ability to delegate. It just seems like he really knew what he was doing from the get-go, again, just on the outside. And I agree with you where I don't necessarily know if there's a good answer on one way or the other, but I still think that you can have really good leadership and good X's and O's, but if you have good X's and O's and no good leadership, right, I don't really see how the execution goes there. And I think it's also really specific for each team. Like, if someone like the 49ers, for example, I think they have a strong culture and they have a strong team. And I like Kyle Shanahan. This is in a world where he, for some reason, is gone, but maybe they could kind of get away with that. But in terms of the right fit at the right time, especially with Matt Stafford and all of that, I think Dan Campbell really absorbed a lot in that first year. As an outsider, again, I thought he handled that situation really well, but that's really a really hard day at the office when kind of your first task is sending off, I think, the only source of hope Lions fans had in my years being alive.
Yeah. It was a dark time, and that entire year was tough, right? Because you want, it's hard. First of all, it's hard to ask a Detroit Lions fan to be patient, right? They haven't had a championship team since the 1950s. So to preach patience during an 0-10-1 season after you're coming off the Patricia disaster, even with everyone understanding this was a bad roster, a quarterback that was, going through a lot emotionally, I'm sure, and just, basically just trying to pull themselves out of one of the bigger holes in franchise history. And that's saying something considering the 0-16 era. It was dark. And then even the next year, like they finished that year 3-3, and people are like, you know what? They improved as the season went on. That's really all the expectations were in year one. So year two will hit the ground running, take another step. They start 1-6. And it's just like, Like, and it got even darker then. Like now you're starting to talk, you bring up the word fire already. Like a year and a half into his career, the man is, four wins in 30 some games. And so, I wasn't one of them, but I could see why Lions fans are starting to get skeptical here. Even, ownership had to come down. And whenever ownership comes down and says, and want, like, let me talk to the media.
Right.
That's a scary moment. That is usually not followed by something good. But she came down, she said, listen, it's all part of the process. We're a really young team. We're really close in a lot of these games. Please stick with us. Things are going to turn around. And almost immediately they do. Almost immediately they go 8-2 in the final 10. And now we are where we are. And it's crazy to think about where we were, because even me as a fan, like, I was going through some embarrassing tweets from last year just out of fun. They get shut up by the Patriots on the road, and I think they go to 1-5. And I'm like, this is a joke franchise. Literal words. I said joke franchise. And I think that was last October. That was 9 months ago. And I feel 180 degrees, like completely different. And part of it is that patient. And looking back, it feels so stupid about it too. Like, this was the youngest roster in the NFL last year. First time offensive coordinator in his first year. Not a great supporting cast, a lot of injuries that they dealt with at the beginning of the season. Like, there's so many reasons, but it's hard to see those in the moment sometimes when your team is playing so poorly. So it's really fascinating how quickly things honestly turned around in like I said, like 9-month period.
Yeah. And it sticks out to me too, because you're right. Where normally the owner coming out and saying those things is kind of a huge red flag.
Yeah.
I could also read that situation as, because he was on the 0-16 team as a player, correct?
He was, yeah.
And I, had kind of read his opening remarks when I had done the podcast last week, where, he said, I want to sit down with the owner. I understand the identity of this city, the identity of this team. So to me, it almost kind of read as more of kind of, we are backing him through this kind of thing. But I don't blame fans, like you said, because that's the unfortunate thing when you take a job like that, which is what stuck out to me, that he really wanted to take it, is that you're not dealing with a patient fan base whatsoever. And for them to remain calm for their first week win of the season to come in week 13 the year prior. But, and again, when they were eliminated from playoff contention, just beating the Packers just for the sake of beating the Packers. I mean, that to me is very Sean Payton classic of, we have nothing to play for, but we're not letting our division rival get in there. But the fact that they were able to really do that at all just says so much to me. And then the draft this year, I'm just super curious about what your thoughts were as it unfolded, and then by the end, because I think people had very different ideas at the start and end of that draft, which was probably the most intriguing thing I've seen in a long time. Yeah.
And general manager Brad Holmes has went into that draft with a 99% approval rating by Lions fans, by our measures. And for good reason, right? He got Penei Sewell, he got Amon-Ra St. Brown, Aiden Hutchinson obviously had a really good rookie season as well. And so it was a little bit of a shock to the system, because it wasn't really what he had done in years past. He had gone with, positional value. Lions fans cringe every time they hear that phrase now, but they had gone offensive tackle, edge, basically every single big position.
It's very Sean Payton trenches building on both sides.
Yeah, that had been, I think they drafted 3 or 4 defensive linemen in the first 3 rounds in just the first 2 drafts. And so okay, this is a build through the trenches guy. This is a guy who, follows all the, analytical models, get the best positions, get the most valuable position. And then he goes out this draft and he's like, wait a second, running back, linebacker, safety in your first 3 or 4 picks, tight end. What? And I'll be honest, for the longest time, including now, I would say I've been pretty strict against a running back in the first 2 rounds. And so certainly wasn't a happy draft night. In fact, Bijan Robinson gets drafted at 10, I think. 10, the Lions had already traded that back to 12. I literally tweet out few, because of course that everyone's like, okay, that's right. The only running back that's going to go in the first round. And everyone knows that I hate drafting running backs in the first round. And then of course, 2 picks later, the Lions do that. But I'm warm to that pick. I will say I've warmed to that pick because, and you'll know this, a guy like Alvin Kamara, pretty valuable. And that is definitely the plans for Jahmyr Gibbs. As much as I don't like a running back and what they do in the rushing game, if you're going to throw it to him 80 times a game, or 80 attempts a season, that's pretty valuable. That we're talking about the passing game. We're talking about the whole reason people don't like the run game is because the passing game is so much more valuable. And if Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be a 5-6 catch a games guy, that suddenly raises the value to a point where it's like, okay, I can tolerate this. I'm still not 100% on board, but I can tolerate that. Jack Campbell is the one where he's going to have to sell me on. Like, Jack Campbell's going to have to come in and have a really good career. And I understand like the value of, I think anytime you think of like a iconic defense in this league, a lot of the times it's that middle linebacker. It's that Mike linebacker that is the nucleus. The problem with that is that they're extremely rare. Like, even in the NFL today, there's maybe 3 or 4 guys that fit that category. And so the Lions got that guy. Well, awesome. They got something that is so extremely valuable and extremely rare in this league. That's great. But they're, a lot of coaches think they've drafted that guy. And so I'm not completely convinced that I'm not really much of a draft analyst. I'm not a scout. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you like Jack Campbell is him. He isn't him. I don't know yet. But I think it's a risk. It's a risky pick. And that's to me like the biggest shift. And part of it feels like this is Brad Holmes starting to feel himself, right? He comes out, he wears the villain shirt at the NFL Combine. On draft night, he's wearing shirts with Dan Campbell's face on it. Like, he's starting to feel comfortable and really be himself a little bit. And so maybe that's what we're seeing in the actual draft picks as well. So I don't know. It's interesting. I will say I'm a little bit more cautious about him than I was going into this draft because he had hit on so many, day 1, day 2, and even some day 3 picks. But listen, I'm always, let's try not to get emotional on draft night guy, because no one knows. No one, as much research as I can do, draft guides I can read, film I can watch, nobody knows. And so I'm willing to see how this one plays out, because it's a fascinating draft. Like you said, I think it's a fascinating draft. It might not have been what I would have done, but that doesn't mean it's wrong.
Yeah, like it's a weird comparison, but it reminds me almost of the Rams, where they've just completely decided to decline to participate in the draft the way that everyone else does.
Right. Yeah.
But it's interesting because, like, you brought up Bijan Robinson going at 10, and the reaction, I think, during the first round was like, are the Lions on something? Like, what's kind of going on over there? But I just was curious. I went back and looked at their last couple draft classes, Ben, just because you mentioned how many, and looking at their 2021 class, taking 2 or 3 defensive tackles after Penei Sewell, and then taking a ton of trench guys last year. I think what sticks out to me as the difference maker here is their investment in the first round capital in those years prior to maybe have the luxury to get away with this.
Yeah.
Whereas you look at the Falcons and they took Kyle Pitts in their first round last year. They have not built the team in the trenches really whatsoever. And it's a one that I'm going to be really, really curious about. I like, to me, I love defense. So I'm just curious, like, again, what he saw. Is it Jack Campbell?
Yeah.
Naturally. Like, what is there in him? Because you're right, that age of just the great linebackers, I don't really know who's kind of this modern era. Patrick Willis, Luke Kuechly, like, there just used to be this list of guys that like were the end all be all of a defense. Like, you're right. I remember when the Saints would play the Panthers, like, it was Luke Kuechly, and that was that shut down. But to your point about people also not liking running backs because they want the passing game, do people not understand that you can't get a passing game going without a run game? And the fact that they have invested in the trenches, and it was very interesting to me too. Then they ended up taking Hendon Hooker, because I also think that changed that perception of the draft a lot. Because let's be honest, if they didn't walk away with a premier trench player or a quarterback, then that skill position group of players looks really, really rickety. But the fact that they didn't have to give much up for him and there's no immediate need to start him, is that something that you could see Hooker fitting in? And what is kind of the perception of Jared Goff at this point? Because he's kind of a weird one at this point. He goes to the Super Bowl. Is it his first or second season? And then, gets kind of cast off. When you talk about psychology, I've felt bad for him for the last 2 years. Not that he's in a bad situation, but just feeling like you were so unwanted that I think they paid the Lions to take him off their hands. If I remember correctly.
It's a fascinating situation, and I haven't settled myself on what I think about Jared Goff, because it has drastically changed again over the last 2 years, to a point where it's like when he came in, the cupboard was bare, right? Their number one receiver was supposed to be Tyrell Williams. He suffers a concussion in week 1 and is out for the season. And the Lions are just ragtag group of guys. Amon-Ra was a rookie there, really didn't see him kind of pop off until the last month of the season. And so you have to like balance, like, oh, was Sean McVay right about this, or are we not even giving this kid a fair chance? And Lions coaches from the beginning have said, like, this is not a bridge quarterback. We believe in this guy, and they've said it the entire time, and I think that has helped him kind of make this transition. There was a really good article out in the Athletic where Zach Taylor, the Bengals head coach, actually went out and reached to Ben Johnson, who was the tight ends coach at the time, now the offensive coordinator. Is like, listen, you got something in Jared Goff. Like, I've seen this guy play, work with him, just give him some time to figure it out. And even that first year when he was the tight ends coach, Ben Johnson and Jared Goff formed a relationship that they obviously carry on today. This past off, or 2 off seasons ago, last off season, not the one that's we're currently in.
Yeah.
They had like a 3-day summit where those two just were in a room discussing things that Jared Goff did well in LA, and how to bring that into what they wanted to do here. And it worked. Like, and it wasn't perfect. There were times when Jared Goff was bad, turned the ball over a ton, but he finished the season 9 straight games without throwing an interception. He has the longest current streak. I think he's like 3rd or 4th all time right now. And everything seems to be kind of working in the right direction. And again, like, the Lions coaching staff is gushing over the guy. One of the interesting things that they've talked about this offseason is how they're continuing to put more on his plate pre-snap. Now he's more in charge of, commanding the offense in terms of protections, in terms of audibles. And a big criticism of Sean McVay during the Jared Goff era was that he was in his earpiece until 15 seconds on the play clock. And now you're starting to, like, I think they brushed it off at the side. Jared Goff brushed it off at the side, but now you're seeing, like, maybe that did hinder his development a little bit. Maybe if you're not given those opportunities, you don't feel the same command, you don't feel the same confidence, you don't understand what's in front of you as much if you're not forced to make those reads, and the guy in your ear is doing it. And so I think he's entering a new part of his career where I think way too many people are eager to write the book on Jared Goff already. Say, we already know what he is. He's been in the league for 6-7 years. We know he is. We know what his ceiling is. He's entering a new part of his career where this is almost a new position for him, where he has more ownership, where he has more jobs to do. And maybe that's what he excels at, that what went overlooked in LA. Maybe he is more of a command type of quarterback, rather than one who is going to, create Patrick Mahomes types play that is going to be pinpoint accuracy. He's still a very talented arm, talented passer, but I think putting more on his plate now gives him an opportunity to maybe be a better quarterback than a lot of people thought he is. I'm not sure he will, reach all those things. You never know. But I think he's found a really good place. He's found a really good support system, specifically with Ben Johnson, to a point where I think people need to maybe start reevaluating who Jared Goff is as a quarterback. And I think this year he's going to have a really good opportunity to, you see some people rumblings, and obviously the Lions aren't a secret anymore. But Jared Goff, I think, is still in a large part downplayed. I think a lot of people are eager to give all the credit to Ben Johnson, which is fair. He's an extremely talented offensive coordinator. But part of the reason all of this is working is because they're doing what Jared Goff does well. And Jared Goff does things well. He's a good quarterback. So it's a huge season for him. He's got 2 years left on his deal. Now they do have Hendon Hooker in the room to push him. I'm fascinated to see where that goes, because it could go in either direction. He could be a career backup. He could be a franchise quarterback. And I think the Lions don't really know right now. I think they just said, it's the 3rd round. This is a good opportunity to take a shot. And you're putting him in a perfect situation. Like you said, coming off the ACL, doesn't have to play a snap, doesn't even have to take a practice snap this year. And the Lions are going to be in a good situation. He'll just learn behind a good veteran quarterback, a good offensive coordinator, good quarterbacks coach in Mark Brunell. And we'll figure it out when we have to cross that bridge. And because you have that 2-year kind of runway with Jared Goff's contract, like, let's figure it out and go from there.
Yeah. And again, I keep drawing parallels to Sean Payton, and it's not like, he's just taken his copybook, but they both also were under Bill Parcells as well. Yeah. And like the first thing that Sean Payton did with Drew Brees was, they sat down, they made a cut up and they said, what are you good at? And that's what we're going to do here. That's the same thing that I've heard he's kind of done with Russell Wilson. There's no point to me in trying to turn someone into someone they're not. But I like how you described him as a command quarterback. I hadn't really heard that phrase before. And I'll be honest, like I'm not a quarterback analyst whatsoever. Like defense is my bread and butter. But, without saying that I can evaluate his mechanics or anything like that, it in the same way that I had, all that stuff came out about Russell Wilson and you were like, oh, whoa, like we had no idea all that was going on. It was kind of the same thing with Jared Goff and the Rams, where I felt bad for him because it did just kind of seem like he got scapegoated as an idiot and kind of treated like one. And, you talk about the X's and O's offensive guru guys. Well, maybe there's kind of a blind spot there and an issue where they think they are the smartest guy in the room and they think that they can, kind of control these things. And rather than let the quarterback sink or swim, it's just, okay, well, I'm going to do it for you. Yeah. But right. How on earth is anyone supposed to improve at football if they're being spoon-fed their responsibilities? And so I didn't love how they kind of like threw him in the trash like that after not really trying to do that at all. So yeah, again, starting and asking you kind of about your background in psychology and if you've applied that here and the things that you see in Dan Campbell. I don't think Jared Goff works anywhere else in this situation, to be honest with you. Yeah. If the roles were reversed, and I think if he went from a Campbell to a Sean McVay, he would just completely feel isolated. Right. So when you talk about the right fit, it might not be the best quarterback in the world, but to me, it's all about that relationship basis. And I've come to learn after Drew Brees retired that like Drew Brees is not the expert. You can't just 1-800 call a quarterback, to quote use either Walsh or Parcells. But like, I've come so far around on Derek Carr just watching his command. So that's why I really resonated with that. I also seen him make really good throws, but it's really how he's conducted himself and just kind of that air and that feeling. And to me, just again, I'm trying to picture like obviously I'm sure Lions fans would love Patrick Mahomes. So that's a stupid thing to say, but in the sense of like having some like technical wizard back there, I think if Jared Goff is able to kind of make it over that hump, he's kind of, to me, ingested that identity of fighting through this adversity and really no one thinking that he had a shot at all. But it again goes to show what a good O-line and trust in your quarterback can do. And to me, that's what Dan Campbell has brought to the table the most is that.
Yeah. I mean, you want to talk about the Detroit identity. That's exactly it. It's fighting through adversity. It's no one believing you and battling through that. And of course that's everyone's calling card, right? Like New Orleans adopted that kind of identity through Katrina. Detroit, blue collar city. Like how many cities call themselves blue collar cities because they want that kind of gritty, like pull yourself up by your bootstraps type of attitude. But like we've heard it for decades here. And this is the first time it feels true. It feels like you've got a cast of players and coaches who were either overlooked or overhyped or whatever it is. And like, they're coming to Detroit to prove something. And, a guy like CJ Gardner-Johnson, I think is a perfect example. A guy who was like, everyone thought was going to get a massive contract. He was playing really, really good football. None of it happens. He comes back to Detroit to reunite with Aaron Glenn. Now he's got something to prove. Now he's got that extra chip on his shoulder. And it feels like this is a stat, like they're drafting specifically for chip on your shoulder guys. Amon-Ra St. Brown, another great example. A guy who's drafted in the 4th round and will recite by heart the 17 wide receivers taken ahead of him in the draft. That's what this team is all about right now. And again, a lot of it is it seems cliche. It's a lot of stuff that I brushed. Like I said, I brushed aside. I'm like, this is football talk. This is whatever. It seems to be working. And of course, the wins suddenly dry up. Maybe it was all talk, but for now it seems to be working. It seems to be the heart of the Lions' identity, and I think Jared Goff is a good, poster boy for that kind of mentality, I would say.
I guess in just my closing remarks, I know we've kind of talked about culture and leadership, but is there any kind of underrated aspect of Dan Campbell or just something that you've noticed he's really made a difference in that isn't kind of one of those obvious monikers?
Yeah, there's a couple things. The first one, and I think the adjective that best describes Dan Campbell is authentic. because a lot of people, even when you watch Hard Knocks, right, you see him do all these like gritty, these little kind of silly things, and you look at him and he's like, oh, this is just like this, meathead guy who's spitting all these colloquialisms that we've heard a million times before. Like, he's not putting on an act. He is not trying to he's not the type of guy that's looking in a mirror and like practicing his speech.
Right.
That is just coming from him. That is just oozing out of him. That is who he is every single day in front of the podium, pulling him aside, anything. He's the same guy he is every day. And I think that helps the message resonate, right? Like, you can tell when someone is trying to fire you up, but they're not acting like themselves. They're trying to put on an act. He is a guy that I think just, he oozes personality. He oozes authenticity, and just, you can tell. I think he can relate to anybody, right? And it can be silly. It can be kind of dopey at times. And, but he's also extremely self-aware too, because like my favorite story from last year, he was on the Pat McAfee show, and, I'm trying to remember what play it was. It was either a fake punt, or it might've been the Penei. I think it was actually the Penei Sewell catch. And Pat McAfee asks him about the play. And he's like, I was actually just distracted by the wave. I didn't even know what the play call was. I was just looking at the wave. And he's joking, of course, but a lot of people bought it because that's their perception of Dan Campbell. And I don't know if he's purposely playing them and trying to play the dopey guy so that people underestimate him. Maybe he's doing that. I think he's just kind of being a goofball because that's kind of who he is. But that's what I love about him too, is just like, he's not afraid to be a goofball, even if it means, publications are going to say, what an idiot, he was watching the wave during the most important play. Like, he doesn't care. He's just going to be himself. Nothing is going to stop him from being himself. And I think that's probably my favorite thing about Dan Campbell that maybe goes overlooked because people are either viewing it as an act or viewing him as corny or whatever. I think he's just being unequivocally himself. And that's something to strive for all of us. It's just to get to that point where you're so comfortable in your own skin that you can just be yourself, whether people are going to write things about you or not.
All right, y'all. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Jeremy. Again, it just sticks out to me that was the first podcast that I ever joined as a sports writer in this industry. And so it did feel very full circle for me to have him on. But, I know that my fan base here is mostly New Orleans people, Saints, Tulane. I might have some general NFL fans in there. And some of you might be thinking, like, what's kind of the push on the Detroit Lions and Dan Campbell? I think that the Lions really parallel the Saints in the identity that they both hold, having that chip on their shoulder, having to go through a lot of adversity as a city, and seeing those struggles play out in your football team, losing a longtime quarterback, and the fact that Dan Campbell and Aaron Glenn are from the Saints. And really, Dan Campbell is kind of that first coaching tree of Sean Payton that, if you ask me, he has been a success so far. And I think you see it the most in his relationship with his quarterback in Jared Goff. I really appreciated how Jeremy put it, where he, referred to Jared Goff as a command quarterback. I had never really thought about it that way before, because at the end of the day, I think what we're all realizing, and I might just be speaking to Saints fans here, is there are a lot more Andy Daltons and Trevor Siemians than there are Drew Breeses. And there's very little of Drew Brees, but there's not that many of the category below that either. And so then you're just kind of in this, I think, B to B plus of quarterbacks and what their edge might be. And perhaps Jared Goff never had a chance on the Rams. I think about that, you explained how much they have, given him pre-snap responsibilities, that they're adding those things onto his plate in Detroit. And when you talk about handling the emotions of a quarterback, I think sometimes, again, you're going to get a really mentally straightforward guy like Drew Brees. But just to be honest, I think a lot of quarterbacks can be a little bit of head cases. That's not a bad thing. They play the most pressured, important, all-encompassing position that there is out there. And sometimes that leads to guys being a little obsessive. It's the same kind of stuff you see in really good head coaches. And I think being able to manage the personalities of quarterbacks is extremely important. And that, to me, is what Dan Campbell really has his pulse on. Instead of treating him like an idiot, which to be honest with you, that's pretty much what Sean McVay did. He took his team to a Super Bowl in either his rookie or second season. And yeah, the no call happened, but the fact that that game came down to that call in the first place, when that was probably one of the better Saints teams that they've had, it's hard for me to really take anything away from him and say that he's a complete bust there. But just, when you don't take the training wheels off of someone, how do you expect them to improve? And then so you think about that, and that he probably felt like his head coach didn't think that highly of him. And then he was unfortunately probably feeling like he was correct. And to go from LA to Detroit, especially again, the lights, camera action that the NFL has put on in LA, like it's definitely a culture switch. But it seems like Jared Goff is more comfortable than ever. And to me, that really goes back to Dan Campbell. I didn't know that Jeremy had an unconventional background, much like myself, and especially one in psychology, because I think that the reason I kind of asked him if he uses that background, and it might be a subconscious thing, is because when you're really looking at this business, you can talk about the X's and O's till you're blue in the face, but those are all play calls drawn up on a piece of paper, ultimately executed by human beings. And that means that you have the good, the bad, and the ugly of who all of those people are. And how do you really handle that and deal with that? How do you keep a fan base engaged and a team engaged when you're coming in first time head coach with the team, and you go 0-8, and maybe there are some guys that think the biting the kneecap stuff was a little over the top, but you never really got that sense at all, because even though they didn't win a game until week 13, they almost got one when they tied the Steelers in overtime right before their bye week in week 9. And then they came out and lost again. And the fact that they then proceeded to win that first game of the season, and I will go back again to Jared Goff running down the sideline and embracing Dan Campbell. I have kind of a soft spot for that team now, but it is a team that I want to root for. It's an identity that, as someone that has kind of talked about my chip on my shoulder and going through things in my workplace, I can relate to that feeling of when your boss treats you like you're an incompetent person, you start to wonder if they're correct. You start to doubt your own instincts and not trust your own mind. And if that's what Dan Campbell has been able to reinstill in Jared Goff, then you can't ask for anything more in a head coach to me. So that's my show for today. Again, I hope you guys are getting something out of this kind of coaching series where, again, I don't pretend to be the expert on what makes a good head coach. That's why I also think it's helpful to hear from people when I'm talking about coaches that I've come to respect, hear the perspective of someone that has covered that team for a very long time. His first season covering them was the 0-16 year. And Dan Campbell being kind of a unique type of coach that he's really starting to see the value in. And it's hard for me to ignore Jeremy's background in psychology and everything that he was able to really describe and provide me insight on. So I'm kind of rooting for the Lions now next season, if nothing else, also to follow this draft strategy that I just find fascinating, because while it was super unorthodox, again, unlike the Falcons, who drafted a tight end and just have been drafting skill players in the first round, the Lions have drafted 6+ high round, either offensive or defensive line players in the first 2 years before this last year's draft class. So maybe he can get away with Jack Campbell. And again, if Jack Campbell can be Patrick Willis or Luke Kuechly, then I don't think anyone's going to be looking twice at that draft at all. But the fact that he's even gotten the benefit of the doubt with such a chaotic draft in the situation that he's in Detroit, I can't wait to follow Dan Campbell's coaching journey from start to finish. So that's all for me. I hope you all had a good 4th of July weekend, and I will be back next week with another continuation of this on Before the Whistle.